You must have heard tales about him. Every storyteller has a version. Every temple has an interpretation. Every scroll offers a different accounting of who he was and what he did, and whether any of it was real at all. Some say he helped a traveling monk fetch sacred scriptures from the distant West and was granted Buddhahood as his reward for 10,000 miles of service and sacrifice. Some say it was not him who received that blessing. The real him, they whisper, was already dead long before the journey ended. His spirit extinguished somewhere on a road that broke better beings than him. Some say the journey never happened at all. That he is nothing but a monkey born from a storyteller's hunger for a hero worth believing in. He is a fable, they say, a cautionary tale dressed in the armor of triumph. But now you will hear a tale which no one has ever known. A tale that exists in the spaces between all those other versions, in the silence beneath the legend, in the truth that survives after the myths have finished arguing with each other. This is not the story they tell in courts or cathedrals. This is the story of what remained when the great sage was gone and what that remaining meant for those left behind in his shadow. The stone had stood on the mountain for countless ages. Since the earliest days anyone could remember, they had said that his remains lay within it, unbroken and dying. Such was the nature of a stone monkey, that the body could be imprisoned while the spirit refused the cage entirely. Though his body was shattered, his spirit endured in the only way spirits know how to endure, by breaking apart and scattering rather than surrendering in one piece. Into 6 relics he divided, and separately they escaped into the world, choosing concealment over capture, choosing the long patience of waiting over the short certainty of defeat. These were the 6 senses of the great sage: the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. And not one of them had been seen in centuries. The one who tells this story has ventured through all the lands that are accessible and many that are not. Among those listening there might be one who is destined. One who carries the particular quality of purpose that cannot be manufactured or inherited, but only revealed through the accumulation of impossible choices made correctly. If such a one exists among you, then perhaps they could recover all that was scattered, and upon the return of all 6 relics to the mountain, he may yet rise again. It is a fool's errand, some would say. The great sage is gone, and the age that produced him is gone with him. The celestial court has already decided that the chapter is closed. The scriptures were retrieved, the journey was completed. The account was settled and balanced and sealed with divine authority. Whatever remained of Sun Wukong was his own problem now, and the court had other business to attend to. But the world has a way of refusing to accept the endings that authority declares final. In the world below the mountain, life continued in its complicated way. A young traveler found himself on paths that seemed chosen rather than chosen by him, moving through landscapes that shifted between the beautiful and the threatening with the casual indifference of a universe that does not consider human convenience when arranging its geography. He encountered the keeper of Black Wind Mountain who had been waiting, he claimed, for exactly this arrival. He found a temple that had been rebuilt after a fire had burned the original along with whatever goodwill had consecrated it, and wondered, as anyone might wonder, what the purpose of rebuilding a structure without rebuilding the spirit that had made it worth building in the first place. He met souls adrift on the paths between destinations, their wheels of existence spinning without direction or resolution, neither advancing nor releasing. And he discovered that a humble gourd, properly understood and properly applied, could serve a purpose larger than its modest appearance suggested. The right instrument in the right hands at the right moment was the oldest principle of the universe, and it applied to gourds as readily as it applied to legendary weapons. The world through which he moved was layered. On its surface, it presented the ordinary pageant of struggle and celebration, of creatures trying to survive and occasionally succeeding. Beneath that surface, older currents ran. The aftermath of the great sage's presence was everywhere in the world he had shaped through the sheer force of his refusal to accept any limit placed upon him. His enemies were still here. His unresolved conflicts had become the conflicts of everyone who came after him. And the relics of his divided spirit were hidden in the keeping of beings who had various complicated reasons for keeping them, not all of which had anything to do with the great sage himself. There was a guardian who had kept a relic secure not because he fully understood its value, but because it had come into his possession through a particular chain of accidents, and he had made himself responsible for it in the way that creatures of honor make themselves responsible for things they did not ask to be responsible for. The relic required a container worthy of its power, and the guardian had done what he could with what he had, and when the Destined One arrived, he surrendered his custody with the dignity of someone who had always known this moment was coming and had spent the intervening centuries making himself ready for it. The path was not straightforward. Paths toward things that matter never are. The Destined One encountered Erlang, who arrived not as a simple obstacle but as a figure carrying his own complicated relationship to the great sage's legacy, his own reasons for the positions he occupied, his own accounting of what the celestial court had done and what it should have done, and whether the two things were as identical as the court preferred to believe. There were enforcers whose conviction in their own authority was precisely the quality that made them dangerous, because conviction without wisdom is simply momentum pointed in whatever direction the system happens to be moving. There were encounters in the woods that taught lessons about speed and environment, and the difference between fighting on terrain that suits you and fighting on terrain that suits your opponent. Every battle was also an education, and the Destined One was a student who learned through his body before his mind caught up with what the body had already understood. The story of the great sage's final conflict with those who opposed him was preserved in fragments rather than in the clean narrative that official histories prefer. He had been offered terms. He had rejected them, not from foolishness but from a clarity about what accepting those terms would mean. The celestial court had welcomed him, or claimed to have welcomed him, and then responded to his presence among them with exactly the kind of treatment that reveals what a welcome actually means when the one being welcomed refuses to diminish himself to fit the shape of the welcome offered. Immortality had been the lure. For that word, entire realms and all the beings within them had ruined themselves, had traded whatever they actually were for the dream of what they might become if only they could persist long enough. The great sage had wanted immortality, yes, but he had also wanted something the court had no framework for granting: to be recognized as what he was, rather than permitted to exist as something smaller than what he was in exchange for the security of an approved position. That bargain he would not make. And the court, which understood power and hierarchy and the maintenance of order but had considerably less experience with the kind of being who simply refused to need what the court was offering, had found itself without its usual tools. Violence was the last resort of those who had exhausted every other instrument of control. They had arrived at violence. And the great sage, being who he was, had not made it easy for them. The victorious fighting Buddha, they called him eventually. The title was a container for a nature that could not be contained, a name assigned to something that had already moved beyond names by the time the name was agreed upon. He attained Buddhahood. That much was not disputed by anyone who had been paying attention. But what he did with it, what he chose once the highest achievement available had been achieved, was the question that separated the official version from the truth. He had come back, or tried to. The celestial rules were not simply regulations imposed from outside, but the very structure of the realm he had entered, and his choice to forego the life above in order to return to the simple joys of the world below had only confirmed every suspicion the court had harbored about him: that he could never be fully absorbed, that his nature was fundamentally incompatible with the nature of the institutions that sought to absorb him, that he would always, in the end, prefer the freedom of the incomplete to the security of the perfect. They had not leveled the mountain as they threatened. They had done something more patient. They had waited. The young traveler gathered relics one by one, each one a piece of the great sage that had chosen hiding over exposure, each one requiring something particular to recover. Not just combat ability, though that was necessary. Not just cunning, though that was essential. Something harder to name. A quality of genuine investment in the outcome that could not be performed or manufactured. The relics could sense the difference between someone going through the motions of heroism and someone who had actually committed to what the heroism was for. He encountered creatures of various alignments along the way. A guardian of a deep valley who had accumulated power through theft and misdirection and was ultimately revealed as both more and less threatening than he appeared. Beings who had been shaped by the great sage's original passing through these lands, who carried grudges or debts or complicated feelings that the great sage himself had never had the opportunity to resolve, because resolution requires both parties to be present, and one of the parties had been divided into 6 scattered pieces across a mountain. There were mothers and daughters in this story. There were wounds that had been carried so long they had become part of the body that carried them rather than damage to it. There were marriages proposed under circumstances that should have made the proposing impossible, and yet the proposing happened because the desire that drove it had long since stopped consulting with sanity about whether its aims were achievable. There was a spider who had woven her web in a place that the great sage had passed through once and had never quite managed to unweave herself from the memory of that passing. There was jealousy wearing the face of family loyalty. There was grief wearing the face of appetite. None of these encounters were simple. The world the Destined One moved through was a world that had been marinating in the consequences of the great sage's existence for centuries, and those consequences had taken forms that the great sage himself would not have recognized as his own doing, which was itself a kind of lesson about the nature of causing things. The celestial court had not been idle during this long period of waiting. Erlang arrived with the measured authority of someone who had learned to present enforcement as conversation, who understood that the most efficient form of power was the kind that made resistance feel unnecessary before it made resistance feel impossible. His offer was clean. Surrender, admit the wrongs, and allow the mountain to be leveled. He had done this before. He preferred not to do it again, not because he had any particular objection to the violence, but because he was pragmatic about what violence cost, including the cost to the one applying it. The response to this offer was characteristic. It was not acceptance, and it was not simple defiance. It was the specific quality of refusal that only emerges from someone who has fully understood what is being offered and has decided that the thing being offered is less than what already exists, even in its diminished and scattered and imprisoned form. "You are stealing my time," came the answer. "Everything else I understand. That the court does not trust me. That they send enforcers to threaten compliance. I understand the mechanics of how power maintains itself. What I do not understand is why you would spend the irreplaceable currency of time on a conversation whose conclusion was already determined before you arrived." The Bull King entered this story carrying the full weight of what happens when a being of tremendous power and appetite makes choices driven by what he wants, rather than what any larger consideration might counsel. His son had turned against him. His wife possessed a weapon that could extinguish the fires of the world. His daughter, born of a different mother, moved through the crisis with the particular courage of someone who has nothing left to protect except the few people she still loves and is willing to do anything to protect them. The family drama that surrounded the Bull King was not a distraction from the main story. It was the main story expressed in personal rather than cosmic terms. Every large conflict has its version at human scale, and the human scale version is where the real consequences live. The Destined One fought the Bull King with the help of companions who contributed their own histories and abilities to the effort. Companions whose loyalty was complicated by their own accumulated experience of being let down by those they had previously trusted their loyalty to. Zhu Baggy, who carried the memory of what he had been before his current form and the knowledge of what he had done to end up in it, offered what help he could offer while making abundantly clear his feelings about the various indignities the situation was requiring him to endure. His complaints were not performance. They were genuine, which made them funnier, which made them more honest than anything a more dignified companion might have offered. Sha Wujing's presence was quieter, steadier, the specific kind of steadiness that comes from having survived humiliation and found something worth doing on the other side of it. Together they recovered what had been hidden and protected, and sometimes deliberately obscured by beings who had their own reasons for holding the great sage's power in trust. Some of those beings had good reasons. Some had reasons that had started good and curdled over the years into something more self-serving. Some had simply gotten used to the power they held in trust and had allowed the original purpose of the custody to become secondary to the fact of the custody itself. The Yellow Brow had taken a relic and turned it toward his own purposes, using the great sage's power as an amplifier for his own nature, which was considerable in its cleverness and considerable in its willingness to use that cleverness in ways that other beings would describe as wicked. He had taken identity and shape along with the power, had borrowed a name and a face to prosecute old grudges through new means, and had ended up in a lake with the question of the relic's fate more immediately pressing than the question of his own. The Somersault cloud found the Destined One when the relics on him reached sufficient accumulation to trigger its recognition. The cloud had been waiting in the mist for the right person, its loyalty to its original master having survived that master's death in the form of a readiness to serve whoever proved themselves worthy of the service. This was its own kind of faithfulness. Not the faithfulness of attachment to a specific individual, but the faithfulness of commitment to a quality that could be recognized and served wherever it appeared. In the Water Curtain Cave, the final pieces of the legacy waited. The armor was there. The weapons were there. The accumulated treasures of a life lived with an eye for the exceptional and a willingness to take what that I found desirable. All of it waiting for someone who could wear it not as a costume but as an inheritance, not as a disguise but as a legitimate succession. The companions who had walked the path with the Destined One reached the boundary of what companions could navigate. The space ahead was shaped by the great sage's own lingering obsession, the unresolved remainder of a consciousness that had been extraordinary and was now, in its scattered and diminished form, still more concentrated than most intact consciousnesses ever managed to be. This space did not accommodate visitors who were merely curious or merely loyal. It required the specific quality that had driven the entire journey. The mind was the last relic and the first. It was the essence unique to every life. The other 5 senses were faculties, instruments of perception and action. The mind was the thing that used those instruments, the thing that gave them direction and meaning and the particular shape of the individual whose senses they were. Because it was the most essential, it was also the most inevitably lost. At the end of life, the senses might be recovered or redistributed or passed on in various forms. The mind dissolved. It was designed to dissolve. That was not a failure of the mind but its nature. What had been Wukong's mind had known this. It had dispersed at the moment of death as minds do. What remained was not the mind but the impression it had left on everything it had touched, the negative space where a consciousness of that particular shape had existed, still recognizable to anything sensitive enough to feel the shape of an absence. The one who had been guiding and watching and occasionally interfering throughout the journey brought this understanding forward at the moment when the Destined One needed it most. The Wukong who had existed, the specific individual who had fought the heavens and befriended a monk and driven a pig companion to magnificent complaint and earned Buddhahood and then walked away from it, that one was gone. The mind was the first to go and the last to be understood as gone. But what made him remains. This was the principle that the universe operated on when dealing with the exceptional. The specific individual could end. The pattern that individual had instantiated in the world could not, because the pattern was not contained in the individual but expressed through them. It existed before them in potential and persisted after them in inheritance. The universe would always bear a successor to the pattern. One who carried the same nature without the same history, who would develop their own history from the same starting point of fundamental incompatibility with limits. This chosen successor was the Destined One, nameless at the start of the journey, named at the end of it, not by being given a name from outside but by becoming the thing that the name described. The 6 relics merged into one being, the scattered senses of the great sage reunited not in the great sage who was genuinely and irreversibly gone, but in the one who had proved worthy of carrying what the great sage had been. "You now look exactly like him," the oldest companion said, seeing in the young figure before him the shape of someone he had traveled with through the longest journey of his long and eventful life. "The armor fit," the staff answered. The Somersault cloud carried him as it had carried its original master, recognizing in the movement the same quality of someone who understood that speed and height were instruments of freedom rather than mere practical transportation. But the ending of this story was not the triumphant restoration of a legend. It was quieter than that, more honest. The great sage's memory contained everything he had been, the insatiable hunger, the genuine wonder, the affection that he expressed sideways because direct expression was not available to a nature like his, the fury at injustice that could not always distinguish between injustice and inconvenience, the love that he had never fully processed and therefore never fully lost. He had been young once, had not known better, had not yet learned from those who might have taught him, was a being of enormous capacity discovering that capacity without guidance in a universe that responded to capacity without wisdom, with either containment or destruction, and chose containment first and destruction when containment failed. The Celestial Court had never fully understood him. Not because they were incapable of understanding, but because understanding would have required them to accept that a being of his nature had legitimate claims that their system was not designed to honor. It was easier to classify him as untamed, ungrateful, insolent, a threat to the order they maintained, than to consider that the order they maintained might be worth challenging by someone with sufficient reason to challenge it. Fortune, someone in the memory had said, is simply humility in the mighty. Those who could afford to be humble because their position was secure enough to survive humility. The great sage had never been in that position. His humility, when it came through the long education of a journey that broke and rebuilt him repeatedly, and even then it was the particular humility of someone who had chosen to bow rather than someone who had been forced to kneel. The distinction mattered enormously to him. It was probably the only distinction that mattered to him at the deepest level. The young successor stood at the threshold of a path that stretched ahead into a future that had been prepared for him by a past he had not participated in. He carried relics in his body, memories in his muscles, the echo of a consciousness in the particular quality of his decisions. He would make his own choices from this foundation. He would develop his own history. He would encounter his own versions of the Celestial Court's tendency to prefer compliance over authenticity. And he would have to decide how he responded to that tendency. The companions could go no further with him. This was the nature of the threshold they had reached. The journey forward was his alone to make, which was not a punishment but a recognition. Certain things could not be done in company. Certain transformations required the particular quality of aloneness that existed only when the possibility of being witnessed had been removed. "Always run," an old voice said, and the words carried the weight of someone who had run, who had taken the available path rather than the theoretically better path that was unavailable, who had survived long enough to have something to pass on precisely because they had chosen survival over dignity when survival required it. And so the new great sage ran, carrying everything that had been gathered and merged and recognized and inherited, carrying the weight of a legend that the world needed and the freedom of a name that had been earned rather than assigned. The mountain waited at the journey's end. The stone that had held the remains of the original still stood there, changed by everything that had happened around it, while remaining itself with the patience that stone has always had about matters of time. What happened when the successor arrived at that mountain? What rose from what had been broken? What the world looked like after the relics had returned to their source, and the source had found its new expression? These were things that no one had yet seen, not in centuries. Not since the original had walked away from Buddhahood to come back to a world that needed something more complicated than a Buddha. Something capable of being wrong and being right in the same moment, of loving imperfectly and fighting with everything, of refusing the ultimate achievement because the ultimate achievement required him to stop being what he fundamentally was. Now you have heard a tale which no one had ever known, the tale beneath the talus. The truth inside the legend. Not the hero who achieved everything but the hero who refused to stop being anything. Not the sage who attained perfection but the sage who preferred an imperfect freedom to a perfect confinement. And in his refusing, in his preferring, in his stubbornness that could not be distinguished from his sincerity, he made himself impossible to fully extinguish, even after death, even after being divided into 6 pieces, even after centuries of waiting hidden in mountains and valleys and deep places of the world. Because the thing that the universe could not do, even with all its considerable patience and all its structural authority and all its accumulated weight of consequence, was make a nature into something other than what it was. You could suppress it, you could scatter it, you could declare it resolved and sealed and finished and filed. But somewhere, in the right person at the right moment on the right mountain, it would find its expression again. The Somersault cloud carried him higher. The armor caught the light and returned it transformed. The staff balanced in a hand that had never held it before and found the grip immediately. And the mountain below grew smaller and the sky above grew larger and the world stretched out in every direction exactly as it had when the original had first risen above it, with the specific joy of someone experiencing for the first time the sensation that their capacity exactly matched what the moment required. Some say he helped a monk. Some say he died on the road. Some say he never existed at all. But this is what happened next.